Can someone just let me know whether the slide is on?
Yep, they're good to go.
Thank you. So as I mentioned before, we are going to talk about the white savior complex in humanitarian assistance. And we'll talk about the journey from colonialism to ethical support. But what is really important, all the reflections that are here are very much so infused by my first-hand experiences on the ground, and also stories that I've been privileged to learn and listen throughout my both clinical, humanitarian, and research work, and also volunteer work in different parts of the world. I will be backing that up with some scientific evidence. So I really encourage a discussion that is both experience but also argument-based. Why is that important? Well, I think that while discussing diversity in general, we tend to look outward and orientalize other cultures, problems, and needs. We often have very good intentions, and we decide to support vulnerable communities. However, our actions long-term may actually sustain harmful dynamics and nurture the white savior complex instead of bringing relief, instead of supporting the growth of the community that we decide to support. And so this presentation aims to discuss these deeply rooted socio-cultural biases that hinder that cross-cultural, peaceful, and also collaborative dialogue and sustainability of global well-being. So that's not going to be about how to become a humanitarian worker. That's not going to be about, this presentation is not going to be about how to go to a refugee camp and work there and how to help and how to support the vulnerable communities. That's not going to be about the vulnerable communities. That's going to be about the community of so-called helpers, including myself. So I want to start this presentation with an anecdote. Once upon a time, I lived in Indonesia, more specifically in central Java, which is predominantly Muslim community. I spent there a couple of months living with the local community and acquiring the norms and the expectations that were guiding that community. And I was lucky enough to also participate in the Independence Day celebration, which is August 17th. And you can see the photo that you may wonder what that illustrates. Well, that's one of the rituals or games that the community engages in during the Independence Day. And I think that this is just a great illustration of what white savior is and what colonialism is in general, and how that applies to humanitarian assistance. Well, people here are climbing this wooden pole. They're trying to get up to touch the Indonesian flag, and so the team that is successful to do that can cut these parcels and get the gifts. Basically, these boxes were filled with some sweets and gadgets. But the problem is that on top of this pole, next to the flag, there is a bag with oil. So someone who is at the bottom of the ground is basically shaking or pulling a rope that is just basically allowing that oil to leak down, making it difficult for the people to climb it up. So whenever they jump onto one another and they try to climb up, they fall down because it's really, really difficult to basically get up. So it's a very tedious process. And I think this is just a great representation of what the communities in many areas affected by military conflicts, by natural disasters, and by colonialism go through while trying to regain their autonomy, while trying to basically establish their own well-being. So I think that this metaphor will unfold throughout this presentation, but I want you to keep this image in mind while listening for these couple of minutes. So another time I came across this post on social media, which I think in a very sarcastic manner represent the gist of what I'm basically not agreeing with. So that was this is a shorter version of the letter written by the author, named Barbie Savior on social media. So, dear child, you inspire me. You inspire me to be the best person to myself and I guess everyone around me, but mostly myself. The best thing I could dream of is to become successful, to have a big family in a big house in beautiful white suburbia. When I asked you what your biggest dream was, you said to dance. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that there is a very small chance we are ever going to meet again. I have a lot of other children to take selfies with. It keeps me busy, but I want you to know there is hope. It's me. But I have to catch a bus, basically go. So I know it's a very bitter and it may not be to liking of many of some people, but it is very much so exaggerated and sarcastic description represents what's currently is happening in the humanitarian assistance and what media are reinforcing in terms of the white savior complex. And just I will give you just two examples of press releases that follow this unfortunately exaggerated picture, but at the same time very true picture. So that is just one of the articles that I came across recently about adoption and just foster care in general. So this adoption that is claimed to be here and described in this particular example is not even legal because that person didn't even meet Tanzania's requirements to acquire legal guardianship of these children. So according to Tanzanian law, it's required that a caregiver is 21 years older than the foster children, which here that was not the case. So why is that problematic? Well, it's very much so problematic according to, first of all, law of that country, and secondly, just to kind of illustrate the point, like imagine on the other hand, Tanzanian woman moving to the UK, deciding she's going to become the parent of 15 or 14 children at risk. Well, there would be voices against, and for some reason, there are not that many voices against these kind of situations when we see white people, Europeans, or Northern Americans or Australians who engage in so-called humanitarian assistance or humanitarian relief, but in fact, these engagements follow and include a lot of violations in terms of law, but also ethics. So every time we see a situation like this, we cannot fail to acknowledge the way that the unchecked worship of whiteness comes into play. We, including myself, white people, in part continue to behave in sometimes unethical way because we are entitled to. We are owning this privilege that we very much so reinforce through different actions on daily basis. And so another example, I'd say less obvious, you have just a picture of a smiling kid. And so what's wrong with that? Well, in looking at not just interactions with so-called other, but specifically photographing the other, it is no wonder that the phrase to take a photo exists in the shape, in this particular shape in English. So we are metaphorically taking something from someone or some place when we photograph them. So one of the researchers, Sontag, draws comparisons between photography and war, writing that shooting a subject and shooting a human being exist on the same continuum. And of course, that may sound as an extreme statement, but when you think about it deeper, we take a part of an identity from someone. And so there are a lot of different social movements supported by different hashtags that promote different images, including that one. And so where photographers entitle themselves to capture photographs of individuals and therefore also capture their bodies, often objectify them, because of the privileged race and positionality. And of course, it's not just about the production and circulation of these images that is problematic, but the white savior gaze and the photographer here or a journalist relies on the audiences that consume these sorts of pictures or articles or any other digital content that represents humanitarian assistance. And so there is a lot of disclosure involved in that. Sadly, that disclosure mostly entails stories of the volunteers, stories of humanitarian workers who talk about their growth and their experiences while using someone else's stories, which again, I would like to emphasize that I don't assume people have bad intentions. It's opposite. People do have mostly good intentions, but we're often not putting enough thought into the long-term repercussions of our good intentions, because we just assume that because we have good intentions, they only are going to produce good outcomes. And I will give you examples of that not being necessarily true. So, put that simply, we can begin with asking why these kind of acts of white saviorism are normalized, why are they accepted, why there is this problem that affects all the communities. That doesn't only apply to communities of the other cultures that are far away from us, that also applies to the communities in our local neighborhoods, where we start marginalizing people because of different factors, whether this is socioeconomic status, race, whether this is a religious affiliation, political affiliation, any other dimension that we want to pick. It's just very easy to label and put that superiority. But of course, when it comes to people of color and then other cultures included in that mixture, it's very much so associated with the white saviorism. So nowadays, white saviorism that stems from colonialism, and I on purpose don't use the term post-colonialism, because post-colonialism would suggest that colonialism era is over, which is not true, simply. So white saviorism turns currently people into projects. So we have a refugee project, we have asylum seeker project, we have survivors of torture in country A, B, C, or D project, we have survivors of violence in community A, B, C, or D project. And that white saviorism also infuses this very subtle attitude toward trauma and personal stories into, and turns them into fundraising campaigns. So it's very catchy now to talk about trauma. It's very catchy to talk about abuse, neglect, exploitation, child soldiers, and all the traumas that people have experienced, to just put a monetary value into it. And this is a point that I will elaborate more on, because my background is in mental health and psychosocial support and education. So that's a topic that I'm very familiar with. And that's going to be the majority of the presentation. The examples are going to support this point. And then we also turn communities and marginalized groups into lucrative causes. So again, it became very catchy to support humanitarian action, to support humanitarian assistance and people in crisis, people from vulnerable communities, just because it became a very lucrative business in specific areas. And so that white saviorism has very little to do with justice, because social justice sees and perceives people in the fullness of their humanity and fights to uphold their inherent dignity and worth at all costs. So we see a person as a collection of very unique experiences. Yes, refugees do experience trauma, but yes, refugees also have resilience. Resilience researchers in most recent investigations have been emphasizing that there is too much of glorification of war survivors on one dimension, meaning only trauma and their ability to survive, there is also that day-to-day life, this everydayness that we don't appreciate because we just don't perceive that as something something worth attention. So in other words, we start exaggerating, or we start putting very thick lines around specific parts of people's experiences, just because we know that this narrative is gonna produce an outcome desirable for us long term. And so the example of these things that I've just mentioned would also include situations when, for example, in a refugee camp, there are people coming for short-term projects and they just literally throw candies at children, or bring toys, or they donate things that are totally useless to the community because, for example, the community need blankets, not teddy bears. And so then they bring, let's say, 100 teddy bears to a refugee camp that hosts 7,000 children. And so that produces that horrible gap, and reinforces this very unhealthy dynamics between this donor and the person that receives this so-called support. So I'm saying that because I've worked in refugee camps in different capacities for the past couple of years, and I've seen these things happening over and over and over again, and that does not bring relief, that does not bring support, that only exacerbates trauma, discrimination, and again reinforces this white savior complex. And I will give more examples of that in a second. So white saviorism sustains systems of oppression by addressing only the symptom rather than the root cause of a problem. So, for example, in the eastern coast of Africa, there are a lot of cocoa plantations that have been exploited by the European and Northern American industry. And so that caused a lot of climate difficulties and exploitation of water resources. And what happens next? Well, the big companies feel like we need to help, so we are going to support humanitarian action and bring drinkable water, clean water to that communities. But these communities do not need long-term bottled water, for example. They need their own wells, they need their own sustainable resources. So that only shows that, okay, bringing that bottled water is addressing the symptom. And then just like one of the many examples, my very early childhood experience was when we moved to a house in western part of Poland, which was the area very much so devoted to people resettled from Ukraine and eastern parts of Europe during the war. And so the legal issues between countries in Central Europe were not resolved when I was growing up there. So there were numerous incidents when, for example, people from Germany were coming, visiting the houses that were their property during the war, but then again, like the borders were reestablished, so that land was reclaimed to be Polish. And what was happening, for example, these German families were bringing to me and my sister and our family candies and some sweets. And I remember as a kid thinking and feeling awful, like that's not what we needed, and that was just the act of this superiority. And these very early experiences like shaped my understanding of the power dynamics that are really unhealthy, that this is the notion of support really requires a lot of introspection and critical self-analytical dialogue with our inner self about like what do we want to do. And so that's just another example of the white saviorism that is very much so intertwined with the power dynamics. And so another example would be people coming to refugee camps for short-term projects, so-called observations, where, for example, a group of young people comes for 1 week or for 2 weeks to launch a project that includes photography, essay writing, whatever kind of creative expression would that be. And that ends always with tons of pictures and photographs taken by the people who come. And so why is that problematic? Well, it is problematic because oftentimes that does not bring a value to the community. It exploits the community. It targets the community as a source of stories that can be easily sold. And I'm not saying that conveying these stories is something that we should avoid. We should raise public awareness of the needs of vulnerable communities, but at the same time, we should be very careful about how we do that, because we work with people, and in the end of the day, people develop fragile attachments. People that are in crisis situations have experienced horrific, horrid losses, traumatic losses, unresolved losses that are continuous problems in their day-to-day life. And so visiting refugee camps, for example, again, with good intentions, is often exacerbating traumas, and is often only contributing to a sense of, I'm trapped here, I am like in a prison, I can't leave, these people come and go, they're free, I can't do that. This is not what is really needed. Another thing that I've been also seeing in refugee camps often, but that more so from the journalists, but also from aspiring humanitarian workers who come and, for example, wander around the refugee camp, visiting the families, interviewing random families, having genuine intentions of developing connections. But what happens is that people feel really offended, because the refugee camp environment is very fragile. These people live there for years, and this is their home. So an analogy would be that a stranger comes with a camera and throws candies at the kids running in my own yard, like next to my house, or even in my own house. And I cannot guard myself because I don't have privacy. I don't have a place to escape and shelter myself from this violation of my privacy. So these things are very sensitive and often, unfortunately, not addressed appropriately on the ground, on the field, in the field of humanitarian assistance. So again, these short-term projects then transfer into someone's CV when someone writes, oh, I have this experience in humanitarian assistance or humanitarian work. I've worked with immigrants or forcibly displaced people, and I've been conducting numerous interviews with people who are applying for jobs or projects or research projects, any kind of engagement related to migration and forced displacement. And I often see that. And then I ask, so what are these experiences that you have with these communities? Oh, I've been on a tour in a detention camp for a day tour or a 1 week experience. And this is just voluntarism that is unfortunately reinforcing unhealthy structures. And I know that it's really important to, again, raise public awareness and make it be a part of the conversation. But at the same time, it has to be shown, and it has to be presented in a way that is not putting the communities in a role of a victim and in a role of an animal in a zoo that can be observed without consent, without a permission. So again, justice, social justice, and humanitarian assistance should not be about sustaining exploitation. An extreme example of that is that, for example, in many Asian, Central Asian and African countries, where it's quite common for white people come and adopt orphans, children are exploited because that became a business or a source of a lucrative support for the community. Actually, not for the community, for very few individuals in that community. So the kids are treated very poorly on purpose. They are being malnourished so that when people from abroad come, they can feel a sympathy and mercy for and pity for these kids and take them, which provides financial support. So this exploitation is very well known in the field of humanitarian assistance and should be really avoided. So also summing that up, the proximity to the communities in need do not equal non-racism. So that comes back to visiting detention centers or visiting communities in need, or befriending someone on Facebook who comes from a different cultural group. That does not make us be non-racists. Non-racist, this is actually quite far away from being non-racist. So why this white saviorism is so normalized? Well, because we are immersed in the culture of white supremacy, and our history is just very much so saturated with these experiences. And so again, it's very much so about how we help, not what we do, because we can again have good intentions, but they can be presented in a very inappropriate manner. And all of us are storytellers. It doesn't matter if you're a humanitarian worker, if you're a consumer, if you watch the videos, if you read press. We are all storytellers, and we convey certain narratives, and the narratives belong to every one of us. And so it's something private, and we should respect that, especially when we work with people who are currently experiencing crisis. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we should acknowledge our privilege and commit to becoming anti-racist. So the first step is to say that we are racists, and that our history, especially white history, European history, Eurocentric history, has very much so prepared us to behave like this. Doesn't mean that we do that with malicious intentions. Oftentimes we don't, but awareness is often a painful process, but a very necessary process to become aware of the impact that we have on every decision that we make on daily basis. So holding ourselves accountable and fostering cultural humility and sense of cultural reflexivity is the key. Then it's important that when we decide to work with communities in need, especially from different cultural backgrounds, we participate in a mutual exchange. We should not come from a position of like, I know, and now I will teach you and I will show you, because I have this wisdom and I've been educated and I've had all these resources, so now I'll give it to you. And this is really disrespectful, and we have a tremendous amount to learn and gain from the communities we're working in and with. So I can give some more examples of that if someone would be interested, like how to actually foster that exchange, if and what kind of programs are good examples of that. So do good, do not post it. And of course this picture is like antithesis to what I'm talking about right now. And so don't take me wrong. If you do humanitarian work, it's important to raise the money, because the money is basically allowing to deliver specific resources to the community. But at the same time, be mindful how you portray yourself. Are you in the center of attention? If you are, why? What story do you convey by the picture that you share? What story do you convey by the article that you write? What story do you convey by the research that you conducted? What kind of narrative you share with the global community? So it's really important to ask these questions and then answer them honestly, especially when it comes to minors, I mean children under the age of 18, who are often objectified, sexualized, and there is just a lot of inappropriate things happening in humanitarian assistance in terms of not receiving and not even aspiring to include informed consent. So informed consent is a process that requires to inform the person who is, for example, on the picture, what the picture is going to be about, how is that going to be used, for what purpose, where, when. And so why is that problematic? Because people who are in situations, for example, post-war situations, they flee conflict, they often flee life-threatening circumstances. I've seen firsthand stories of people who have been persecuted, put in jail, hurt, physically injured because of the post made by some volunteers on social media who just cluelessly posted picture with them, which allowed other violent groups to identify that person, and chase them down and cause tremendous harm to them and their families who were also trapped back home. So we need to be very mindful of what we do. Every single picture that we take is a story behind it, and we should be very cautious. We should be just very cautious every time we decide to take any picture. And so ethical storytelling, again, is about this partaking in someone's stories, respecting someone's story, and informed consent is the key to that. We can share someone's story if they allow us to do. This is just an example of a very interesting project called Unpacked Refugee Baggage, which I encourage you to just Google and see the exhibition. So basically, when we work with people in need, we should never perceive them only as the victims and don't portray them through the lens of trauma only, but also focus on their resilience, because especially given the socio-political climate in many countries currently, it's important to be aware of the impact our words and our digital content that we post have on migrant communities and refugee communities, just because we can just unintentionally reinforce harmful biases. And that's a very sensitive matter, but I'm raising this point here because it's just a part of this white savior complex. Then be honest about your motivations. So where is the line between received personal appraisal and real contribution? I mentioned before that white saviorism is with us because we constantly reinforce it, and our culture reinforces it. Why? Because we have such a thing like altruism, and there are many theories on altruism and why it evolved in the human species, not only human species, but in this case that applies to us. And so one of the theory suggests that we reduce our own personal discomfort by helping others. So that's a very effective strategy to go to someone who we perceive as more vulnerable and help them out. Well, many people go to that field of humanitarian assistance with this kind of background. And so if you had traumatic past experiences, does that mean you cannot be a good humanitarian worker? No, but you have to resolve these issues, because if you go to work every day, it doesn't have to be a refugee camp. It can be a school, it can be a kindergarten, or it can be a local community center where you work with people and you go there to kind of heal your soul, while at the same time often unintentionally and unconsciously putting burden on other people and putting some conflicting messages out there, and that often contribute to the development of unhealthy relationships with the community members, because the attachment is a very sensitive matter, and if we infuse that with personal interests, we may hurt someone. So always asking about the motivation, it's always important, and it really matters to be honest with yourself. Like, why do I want to do that? I want to do that to fix myself? Do I want to do that to feel better about myself? Maybe I'm so guilty and I feel so guilty, so I need to relieve this sense of cognitive dissonance that I have by helping others. And so all these motivations can be acknowledged, and then once we realize the impact that they have on our actions, we can actually make the real contribution, because we are just vulnerable ourselves, and we do not portray the communities in need as the only vulnerable people in that equation. So from the space of being vulnerable, we can actually have a mutual, respectful, and fruitful dialogue. But if we come from a place of that superior figure, it's very unlikely we will actually be able to listen. And then accept that you can't be an expert in what's best for a community you are a guest in. It's important, because the fact that someone haven't received formal education and maybe they follow religious doctrine that you don't agree with, it's not the reason for you to discredit their values. I see that constantly in mental health field, when people come kind of from academia and project Western evidence-based interventions and treatments onto people who refuse them. And so then there is this bad impression, like, why the communities do that? This is such a good model. This is such a good treatment. We only have good intentions. Well, yes, but we come from a position that only our knowledge is best knowledge and only our knowledge is the accurate knowledge. And so how would we feel if someone came to us with this kind of attitude? We would get defensive and we would not appreciate it at all. So that's why it's important to explore the needs of the community, the beliefs of the community, and their motivation also to seek help or not to seek help. So there are multiple models, especially in the qualitative indigenous research methodologies on how to do that while developing treatments, while developing interventions, evaluation programs, etc. But also there are just many research investigations recently that focus on that area, on how to become more, not culturally competent, but how to become more culturally humble in that experience of being a researcher or a clinician or humanitarian worker, broadly speaking. So finally, have an exit strategy, but fight for justice and equity. So what I mean by that is that we should not aim to reinforce dependence on humanitarian assistance. There are cases in many countries affected by military conflict or climate change where local communities have been just tied and closely connected to humanitarian assistance, and because of that they have not developed their own sustainable resources. Because why would they? They don't have to. And what I mean by that is that instead of bringing only international volunteers who come to refugee camps and teach, for example, English for 2 months and they disappear and they come and they go, and there's no continuity between these workshops or programs or whatever, we should maybe outsource people from the community, because there are teachers, there are educators, there are people with a lot of knowledge and wisdom who can, with a little bit of support, develop other skills or helpful skills, and we could scaffold their growth so that they develop their own autonomy, because that should be the goal of humanitarian assistance, to foster the autonomy, not foster codependence, because again, the codependence comes back to our ego. Of course, this is very, very flattering, but it should not be the goal. And lastly, when you read different articles about humanitarian assistance and people talking about their experiences in humanitarian work, we often hear the phrase, I give voice to the voiceless. And I want to end this presentation saying that everyone in this world has the voice, even those that are in the extreme crisis. Everyone has the voice. The matter is that we may just have access to the microphone that they don't have access to currently due to different circumstances. So we can pass this microphone along, share it, and learn how to listen instead of how to be only heard and received. So that again takes that journey into cultural humility and humbleness and curiosity at the same time. And combating, I would say, the white savior complex is the process. It's a process for me. It's a painful process. It takes a village to really, I would say, decolonize humanitarian assistance, but I think it's worthwhile because there is a lot of beauty in that world. And on this note, I want to finish and open the section for questions and comments about the presentation or the topic or anything that I mentioned and didn't maybe elaborate on that.
There's the 2 questions in the chat. Just the first one from, I believe, Amira, who said, I'm a mixed woman. I feel it is very difficult to talk about my race and culture. How can I use this information to improve how I talk to others about racism or social justice?
Thank you for this question. I mean, first of all, I want to put it out there. Talking about racism is not easy. It is uncomfortable for many people. It's uncomfortable to talk about it. It's uncomfortable for many people to listen as well. And I'd say the more you do that, the easier it becomes. It becomes as a second nature. I think that at least from my personal experience, because I don't think that there is a set of golden rules on how to talk about racism. If there are rules like this, I would rather question how they apply, because everyone's experience is very different. Everyone grows up in different circumstances, and these socio-cultural factors bring different flavors. So I'd say that exploring your own values as a person, I'd say it should be the beginning of that journey. What you stand for. Racism, if racism makes you angry, that's perhaps because of other values that are much deeper, like authenticity, maybe justice, maybe fairness, maybe empathy, maybe compassion. So dig deeper into that, and then discover that on the other side of this equation, there are also people who share sometimes similar values, but they express that in a very different manner. And so we cannot really decolonize humanitarian assistance or combat racism if we build bridges between each other. We should strive to understand each other. We should strive to understand each other's motivation and bring personal experiences to kind of encourage that openness and vulnerability, because often the discomfort that stems from being in the place of vulnerability triggers a lot of defensiveness. Defensiveness triggers a lot of anger. Anger oftentimes triggers a lot of aggression. So I'd say that being open and authentic to yourself is the key. So unfortunately, I don't have, I think, golden standard on how to talk about racism, but talking about it is already an important step.
The next one was, can you talk about cultural humility?
Yes. So cultural competence, as many of you know, is a set of competencies. We assume that we can acquire cultural competence of culture B or D or XYZ. So competency suggests that this is kind of an end goal, like we can acquire it and that's it. Whereas in fact, we are not able to acquire all knowledge about all cultures. The humility model suggests that we should engage in self-reflection and that reflexivity. So what that means is that we should foster the curiosity and our place in the diet that we are in with a different culture. So what is my motivation? Why do I think and perceive this culture this way? How can I learn? It's very much about learning, asking questions, listening, instead of acquiring that cultural competency and consuming thousands of books about a specific culture, because there's always going to be an individual from the culture who will surprise you. So we should rather perceive that as a continuous journey instead of as a set of competencies that you can just like buy in a jar and put on your CV.
Awesome. And you guys can feel free to unmute, but we do only have a few minutes left. So just the next question was, how has your experience working / living outside of the United States compared to your experience here regarding how white saviorism manifests?
Well, this is a difficult question. I have a lot of thoughts about it. I come from outside of the United States, so for me the comparison is I think other way around, but it's a topic that should be discussed more across the globe. I think not only the United States, but in many countries. It's really important because humanitarian assistance in general comes from the white background, white colonial background. So having more conversations is really, really important. I don't want to draw very specific comparisons between the United States and other cultures, because I'd say that I think personally I just perceive that more as a global movement and global trends instead of trends specific to one particular culture or country.
Can I follow up real quick? That was my question.
Yeah.
I guess I meant not the way the United States goes out and continues to perpetuate colonialism, but how the white savior complex is alive and well just within our own borders. Does that make sense?
You mean within our own borders?
Just like, as you know, for the white savior actions that take place just in our own communities. It's not like a
Yeah.
global relief effort.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I get it. So yeah, I'd say that that comes, you know, to one of the first points that I made about othering people who are around us. So that doesn't have to be other country, that doesn't have to be international context. It's literally, you know, your neighbor and how you perceive your neighbor in terms of their socioeconomic status. Like, you can multiply these examples. Well, I'm not going to hang out with this person because they come from a junkie family, they come from this family, they come from that family. And so that othering brings that risk of being in that one savior place. And of course, currently there is just a lot of racism infused in all of that, because white savior complex is very much so connected to racism, systematic racism, individual racism. So it happens just next door. You don't have to travel to an exotic country to witness it and take pictures with kids in orphanages. No, it really happens next door. When you decide to patronize, for example, the community members who are community members, they share the same community with you, but for some reason they are being excluded. And then what is that reason? So racism comes from the entitlement, and that entitlement comes from the privilege, and that unearned privilege is very much so tied to a white savior complex.
So it is 1:50, and I want to be respectful to everyone's time. I don't know if Deanna, you have a few minutes to stay on for the last two questions, but
I have a couple of more minutes to answer if someone has a question.
But yeah, feel free to leave if you need to. The one of them was, is white guilt not a good motivator for activism? And if so, how do you overcome white guilt?
So I'd answer the question from a psychological perspective, so that it's purely a cognitive dissonance. Of course, in the context of that presentation, we talk about white guilt because that applies to white people who feel guilty for the oppression, for the colonialism, and all the bad things that as the society we've done to people who we define as vulnerable or in a minority. So I think that it's okay to feel guilty. Like, there is a lot of bad things that have happened and that our societies have done and continuously do. So having a sense of guilt is a human experience, and we can feel that on a daily basis. This is not something to escape from, because as soon as we assume that, oh, this is really painful, I need to get rid of it, let me become an activist, it's just muffing that guilt and not resolving the problem, not resolving the root of that problem, because then I'm easily putting myself in the position of a helper, that I'm a fixer, I'm gonna bring a value to the community because of my guilt. And it can be a trigger, it can be a motivation, but I'd say that the change starts with a very authentic and honest self-critical dialogue. Why am I feeling guilty, and why is that uncomfortable? Can I talk about this guilt with a person of maybe different color of skin? Can you talk about racism with, you know, even your peer? Can you talk about, have you talked about it? Have you addressed these issues? Like, have you brought to the table openly and just discuss it? You know, one side is going to feel harmed because of historical trauma and other factors, and it's okay to talk about it. And at the same time, the other side is going to struggle with a lot of guilt. And I think that it's not about glorifying one experience over another. It's very much so about understanding one another. And of course, we need to acknowledge the pain, because there is a hierarchy, and unfortunately, the power dynamic that has been reinforced through the centuries, that has been unhealthy and contributed to the development of racism. But ultimately, what do we strive? We strive peace and dialogue. And the dialogue and peace doesn't come from the place of glorifying one experience over another, because that is a different type of supremacy that I don't think should be striving to develop. So I think coming from the place of vulnerability is the key. But to be in that place and openly say that, it takes a lot of personal effort, and I wouldn't say that it's ever achieved and accomplished, because you may meet someone who will challenge this belief, and your castle will just collapse, and we'll have to reestablish that from the beginning. It's a process, it's a mutual growth, and it takes two sides to move forward, not only one side.
This could be the last question. There's one more after this, but depending on time. How are the characteristics of white saviorism present in other non-humanitarian endeavors? And then she says, namely the suggestion from white folks of privilege that, in quotes, one must see the world to find themselves.
One must see the world. Can you repeat? I
Yeah,
can't hear you.
she says one must see the world to find themselves. And then in parentheses, like one-way tickets to Southeast Asia.
Yeah. So obviously I was talking here about humanitarian assistance, but giving you, other examples. Like think about just the pop culture, think about politics, think about economy, think about literally any field you want to think about. Ask yourself a question: how much of white people influence is there in terms of everything, literally everything? You can even take like a product in the shop, take it and look at it and ask yourself a question: where does that come from? How that has been produced? Who had an impact on how it is produced? Why are you even interested in this product? Ask yourself this question. So it's all very relative, but I'd say that these branches of white saviorism are very scattered on all areas of our functioning. For example, recently I've been participating in academic collaboration about anti-racism movement in journal publications, and we were developing ideas, and one of the ideas was to encourage the people of color to collaborate more and to share their ideas. And to me, that was not acceptable, because again, that is putting people of color in the place of being objects, or rather subjects of the research or subjects of the investigation instead of participants. So the intention was good, but then the way it was put, not necessarily. So I think that paying attention to the storytelling that we all engage in on a daily basis is important, because the story that we tell to each other and we share, and we also listen and consume, are infused with that white savior complex. So anytime I come with the superior attitude of like, I'm a helper because I have these resources and I'm entitling myself to help you because I assume that you are in a vulnerable position, ask yourself a question like, where does that motivation come from? And like, what makes you believe that you are in a better situation, and why your help would be a better help for that person, or that needed, mandatory, necessary help? Why don't you think about that in a way of like, let that person teach me something? So I know it's more of a philosophical, I think, argument that I made, but I'm not sure if that answered your question. If you want to follow up on that, I'm happy to hear what you meant.
So the last question, the person actually left, but I just had a comment. When I was on a exchange, they focused more on relationships and just being there with the people, and being there more as side by side with them rather than trying to push an agenda or do something for them. And we never, it wasn't like we were giving gifts. We were just being there and showing that they were humans and deserved love and like conversation. How do you think we could kind of take that mindset into like efforts here in our own communities and things like that, where it's more relationship conversation based rather than I see this need and we don't have that conversation before?
Yeah. So, I think that, frankly speaking, in my opinion, it's also okay to acknowledge that, well, due to different circumstances, often privileged, we have specific resources that we may share because of different upbringing, different disparities, it's just the matter of fact. Here are the resources, here the resources are not available. But then it's important how we share these resources, and coming from the place of the vulnerability, and also just genuine, authentic interest in developing these relationships. I think it's healing, it's building the communities, and fostering the partnership instead of just a kind of a one-sided dynamic is important. But from my experience of working with indigenous populations in different countries, with politically and religiously oppressed groups and persecuted groups, from survivors of war, this dialogue is not going to be successful if we pretend that we are kind of out of this equation, that we just come and we have these beautiful intentions and we have no difficult feelings underneath. Like, if we try to hide them, this is just not genuine, it's not authentic, and long term can be abusive. So I think you raised an important point of having a conversation and listening, but having a conversation and being there for another person also can sometimes be flavored with the white savior complex, because what is that about me that I entitle myself to listen? So I'm such a good listener, and like all the stories need to now be told to me. I think we also need to kind of normalize it. Like, people don't want to just sit next to us and share these stories because, oh, we have this white, vulnerable, guilty person who comes and now wants to learn everything about my upbringing. We need to be just normal in all of that, and like be just human and normal and authentic and have guts and humor and talk about all of that, because it's a part of our common shared collective experience. It's okay to talk about it, put it out there, and just acknowledge whatever happens to you. And I think that being authentic to yourself brings long term this benefit of bridging the gaps instead of building these walls or whatever borders around, metaphorically or physically. I think it's again no one recipe on how to do that, but I think that being extremely afraid and anxious about not overstepping someone's boundaries is also not a solution, because the more we avoid something, the more anxiety we have about it. So practice exposure practice, and that acceptance of internal, I think, emotions and feelings is an integral part of this experience. And if we fail, we acknowledge, yes, I failed, and next time I will do better.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this presentation and fostering this conversation. And thank you everyone else for joining. There's a few more presentations coming up this afternoon, so if you have time, check them out.
Thank you for having me. If you have any questions, please send me an email. I'm happy to discuss anything you want to discuss.